So you just went out and bought your brand new DSLR camera, but you have no idea how to use it. Or you're looking into buying a new camera and you're considering a DSLR, but you don't know whether or not you should buy one.
Let's help with that.
First things first, it's important to know what your DSLR is capable of doing. Beginners will often set their cameras to auto mode because they don't want to deal with all the complicated settings. But the problem with that is any $100 point and shoot camera can do auto mode almost as well as a DSLR. The whole point of buying a DSLR is so that you can manually set up your shots.
In filmmaking, the camera shouldn't control you. You should control the camera. That's the whole point of buying a DSLR. Being on auto mode is okay for certain situations, but if you want to get the most out of your DSLR, you should set it to manual mode. This will be indicated by the M on the top of your DSLR. In manual mode, filmmakers have full control over the 3 key elements that control your video: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These 3 elements control the exposure of your footage, but can also be used for artistic purposes as well.
Aperture can often be confusing to beginners because it's made up of some weird symbols you've probably never seen before, including an F followed by some weird number. But don't get worried. Aperture is really simple to understand after you get the hang of it. Basically what Aperture does is control the amount of light that passes through the lens into your camera by controlling the iris in your lens. Now you might be asking yourself, what does this really have to do with anything? Well, aperture is one of the 3 main keys that controls your exposure, but it also controls another artistic element of your shots: depth of field. You might not know what depth of field really is, but all it actually does is set the amount of blur that appears in your background, in your foreground, and how much of the image is actually in focus. f8, for example, will allow for most of the image to be in focus, whereas f1.8 will allow for a blurry background and foreground while keeping sharp focus on your subject. You can think about it this way: a lower number after the F will result in more depth of field, which means more blur in the background and foreground, and a higher number will result in more of the image being in focus. f1.8 also allows for a larger iris in your lens, which means more light coming in, and f8 allows for a smaller iris, meaning less light. You can think about it like this. Picture some curtains in your room. f1.8 is represented by opening the curtains all the way, letting in more light. Whereas if you only open the curtains a little bit, you're letting in less light, just like f8.
Before you set your shutter speed, you must understand what frame rate you're using. Right now we're using 24 frames per second. What that basically means is that the camera's taking 24 pictures every second. The same goes for 60 frames per second. With 60 frames per second, the camera's taking 60 pictures every second. The reason we're using 24 frames per second is because it mimics the look of old films, and is commonly used in the movie industry. To get the best results on your footage, set the shutter speed to twice the amount of your frame rate. For example, right now when we're using 24 frames per second, we're also using 1/50th of a second for our shutter speed. The reason for this is that 24 times 2 is 48, but we don't have 1/48th of a second for our shutter speed. So we just go to the closest one, which is 1/50th. We'll go more in depth with this in another episode, and how shutter speed affects the look of your videos.
The last setting that controls your exposure is ISO. This is usually set after you set your shutter speed and aperture. What ISO basically does is adds light to your camera's sensor. Now, this may sound all good, but there's a catch. This is because the higher you set your ISO, while you are adding more light, you're introducing digital noise, which decreases the image quality of your shot. What we'll usually do is set our shutter speed to 1/50th of a second, like we mentioned before, and then set our aperture, depending on what kind of look we want for the shot. After that, we'll check the exposure and then set our ISO accordingly. But we usually have a rule of thumb not to go much higher than ISO 800, because once you go past that, you're going to introduce a lot of digital noise and your image quality is going to decrease rapidly. You can think of ISO this way: a smaller number is better and a higher number is worse.
Now if you're wondering about the audio that comes with your DSLR, the microphone that is inside is pretty bad, so Usually what we do is use an external mic. Right now we're using the RØDE VideoMic Pro, and we'll dive deeper into that in another episode. Hopefully by now you have a better understanding of how to use your DSLR. To tell the truth though, the best way to learn how to use it is just by using it. It took us about a month before we actually knew how to use most of the features on our DSLR. And we still have a lot to learn. If you have any more questions about how to use your DSLR, feel free to comment down below. We'll be happy to answer. This is Mackie Mallison.
And this is Henry Craddock. And this is FilmGuide.